The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet suburban streets as Mrs. Chen made her way home from her prenatal appointment. At 8 months pregnant, she had just received wonderful news. Her baby girl was healthy and growing perfectly. She hummed softly to herself, one hand occasionally resting on her belly as she felt her daughter's gentle kicks. The peaceful drive took an unexpected turn when red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Mrs. Chen carefully pulled her silver SUV to the side of the road, making sure to stop in a well-lit area. Her heart rate picked up slightly. She knew she hadn't been speeding or broken any traffic rules. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, taking deep breaths as she had learned in her pregnancy classes. She gathered her license, registration, and insurance documents, placing them neatly on the dashboard before resting her hands visibly on the steering wheel. Officer Miller approached her window, his boots crunching on the gravel. Mrs. Chen noticed immediately that something was off about his demeanor. His hand rested unnecessarily on his belt, and his face wore a scowl that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with a greeting. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she handed over the documents she had already prepared. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" she asked politely, her voice steady despite her growing unease. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked from her face to her expensive car, then to the address on her license. "This is a nice car for this neighborhood," he said, ignoring her question. "Where did you get it?" Mrs. Chen's chest tightened at his tone, but she kept her composure. "My husband and I'd bought it last year. We live just 3 blocks from here in Cedar Heights." The officer's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "Cedar Heights? Really?" He stepped back, making a show of looking her up and down. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, I'm 8 months pregnant," Mrs. Chen explained, her hand protectively covering her belly. "I just came from my doctor's appointment. Here's my medical bracelet from the clinic if you'd like to see it." "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice growing louder. "Or are you refusing to comply with an officer's orders?" The sun felt impossibly hot as Mrs. Chen carefully maneuvered her pregnant body out of the car. Her back ached from standing, but Officer Miller made no move to speed up his investigation. He walked circles around her car, peering in windows and making comments about how someone like her could afford such a vehicle. Across the street, neighbors began to take notice. An elderly couple paused their gardening to watch. A young woman walking her dog slowed her pace, phone in hand. Mrs. Chen could feel their eyes on her, some concerned, others just curious. "I don't know what's going on here," Mrs. Chen said, her voice wavering slightly as she felt her baby move restlessly inside her, "but I've done nothing wrong. I live in this neighborhood. I'm a resident here." "Sure you are," Officer Miller smirked, tapping her license against his palm. "And I suppose next you'll tell me you've got some fancy job too." Mrs. Chen straightened her back, despite the discomfort. She thought of her husband, of the life they'd built together, of the baby they were about to bring into the world. She thought of all the stories he'd told her about standing up to injustice, about maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice. "I'm a corporate lawyer," she said quietly but firmly. "And yes, I do live here. I've lived here for 3 years. You can verify everything I'm telling you." The officer's radio crackled, breaking the tension momentarily. More neighbors had gathered now, their presence both a comfort and a source of humiliation for Mrs. Chen. She could feel sweat rolling down her back, her feet swelling in the heat as she continued to stand there, watching Officer Miller deliberately take his time with each unnecessary check. Little did Officer Miller know, his actions that day would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the entire police department to its core. But for now, Mrs. Chen stood in the sweltering heat, one hand on her pregnant belly, praying for the strength to maintain her composure in the face of such blatant discrimination. The situation was already tense when Officer Miller pulled out his phone, making a show of taking pictures of Mrs. Chen's car. The afternoon heat had become unbearable, and her ankles were swelling painfully as she continued to stand on the sidewalk. She could feel her baby moving restlessly, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. "This car costs more than you could make in 3 years," Officer Miller said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Mind telling me how you afforded it?" He walked around the vehicle again, deliberately scuffing his boot against the pristine silver paint. Mrs. Chen took a deep breath, trying to stay professional despite the growing humiliation. "Officer, I've already explained that my husband and I purchased this car legally. You can verify the registration and insurance documents I provided." "Oh, your husband?" Officer Miller sneered. "And what does he do that lets you drive around in a car like this, in a neighborhood like this?" He gestured dismissively at the elegant homes lining the street. The young woman walking her dog had stopped completely now, her phone held steadily in front of her. More neighbors had gathered on their porches, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Chen could hear their whispers, see their concerned faces. "Sir," Mrs. Chen's voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground. "I don't understand why you're questioning my presence in my own neighborhood. I've lived here for 3 years. You can ask any of these neighbors." Officer Miller laughed harshly. "Oh, I'm sure they'd say anything to avoid trouble. Now let's talk about what you're really doing here." A wave of dizziness washed over Mrs. Chen. The combination of pregnancy, stress, and standing in the heat was taking its toll. She steadied herself against her car, which only seemed to agitate the officer further. "Don't touch the vehicle," he barked. "Step away and keep your hands where I can see them." "Officer, please," Mrs. Chen's voice cracked. "I'm 8 months pregnant. I need to sit down." She could feel her baby kicking more forcefully now, responding to her elevated heart rate. "You can sit down at the station if you keep giving me attitude," he threatened, reaching for his handcuffs. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, and Mrs. Chen's heart nearly stopped. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped forward from her garden. "Officer, I can vouch for her. She lives in the blue house on Cedar Street. I see her every morning when she leaves for work." Officer Miller turned sharply toward Mrs. Rodriguez. "Ma'am, please step back. This is a police matter." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger. A teenager on his bike was streaming the entire incident on his phone. A couple walking their children to the park had stopped, the mother quickly ushering her kids behind her while the father pulled out his phone to record. "I've called the station," someone shouted from across the street. "They're sending a supervisor." Officer Miller's face reddened, but he didn't back down. Instead, he seemed more determined to assert his authority. "This is a routine traffic stop," he announced loudly to the gathering crowd. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately." But nobody moved. They stood their ground, phones recording, witnesses to the injustice unfolding before them. Mrs. Chen felt a complex mix of emotions: humiliation at being treated this way in front of her neighbors, gratitude for their support, and fear of how this situation might escalate. "My husband," she started to say, but Officer Miller cut her off. "I don't care if your husband is the King of England," he snapped. "Right now, you're going to explain to me why your car's tinted windows exceed legal limits." It was a complete fabrication. Her windows were factory standard, and they both knew it. A car alarm went off somewhere down the street, making everyone jump. Mrs. Chen placed both hands protectively over her belly, trying to calm her unborn child, who was now moving frantically. The baby could sense her distress, and that knowledge only made her more anxious. The sound of another police siren in the distance made Officer Miller pause, his hand still resting on his handcuffs. What he didn't know was that help was already on the way, not just the supervisor, but someone who would make him regret every second of this encounter. The neighborhood had never seen anything quite like this before. What started as a few concerned onlookers had grown into a small crowd, their phones raised like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. The teenager who first started streaming, a high school student named Andy, had already gathered thousands of viewers on his live feed. "Everyone's watching this," Andy called out, his voice carrying across the street. "Over 2,000 people are seeing everything right now." His hands were shaking, but he kept his phone steady, determined to document every moment. Officer Miller's head snapped toward the sound. "This is a police matter. Anyone interfering will be charged with obstruction of justice." But his threats only drew more attention. Mrs. Chen's next-door neighbor, a retired teacher, stepped onto her porch with her iPad. "I'm recording too," she announced firmly. "And I'm sending this directly to my son who works at the local news station." The atmosphere was electric with tension. Cars slowed as they passed, some people pulling over to join the growing crowd. Mrs. Chen still stood in the scorching heat, her face showing signs of distress as she pressed one hand against her lower back. "Officer, please," called out Mrs. Rodriguez from her garden. "Look at her condition. She needs to sit down." The elderly woman's voice trembled with anger. "I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never seen such treatment of a neighbor." A young nurse still in her scrubs had joined the scene. "As a medical professional, I'm concerned about the health of both mother and baby. This level of stress could trigger early labor." She took a step forward, but Officer Miller waved her back. "Stay where you are," he ordered, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The growing number of witnesses and cameras seemed to make him increasingly agitated. Someone in the crowd was on the phone with the police department. "Yes, I'm reporting an officer who's harassing a pregnant woman. Yes, we have multiple videos. No, she's done nothing wrong. He's making her stand in the heat." The sound of voices overlapped as more neighbors shared the live stream and called their friends. "Are you seeing this? It's happening right on Cedar Street. Someone needs to do something." A school bus stopped at the corner, and the driver, Mr. Washington, opened his windows. Even the children inside fell silent, sensing the gravity of the situation. He reached for his radio, his years of emergency response training kicking in. "I'm counting at least 15 witnesses," Andy narrated to his live stream audience, his young voice steady and clear. "Everyone can see she's pregnant. The officer keeps threatening her even though she's shown all her documents." The nurse had begun filming the medical aspects specifically. "I'm documenting signs of physical distress," she said loudly enough for her recording to pick up. Visible sweating, facial pallor, signs of fatigue and anxiety in a late-term pregnant woman being forced to stand in direct sunlight. Mrs. Chen's composure was remarkable despite her situation. She remained quiet, her hands protectively cradling her belly, but her eyes showed a mixture of fear and determination. Every few minutes, she would close her eyes and take deep breaths, clearly using pregnancy relaxation techniques to stay calm. A delivery driver pulled up and parked nearby. He grabbed his phone and started recording too, adding another angle to the documentation. "This is going straight to my supervisor," he announced. "Our company has protocols for reporting civil rights violations." The neighborhood kids on their bikes had formed a small cluster at a safe distance, their young faces serious as they watched. One girl whispered to another, "My mom's a lawyer. I just texted her everything." Officer Miller's body language had begun to change. His earlier aggressive stance had shifted to something more defensive as he realized just how many eyes were on him. The cameras weren't just recording his actions, they were broadcasting them live to an audience that grew by the minute. "The truth always comes out," Mrs. Rodriguez said loudly, her garden shears still in her hand. "Every single minute of this is being recorded, every single word." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and a ripple of relief went through the crowd. But what no one knew yet was that the real surprise was still moments away. The next few minutes would change everything, not just for Officer Miller, but for the entire police department. In his downtown office, District Attorney Mr. Chen was reviewing case files when his phone started buzzing nonstop. First came a text from their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, then another from the local news station, followed by messages from several colleagues. His secretary rushed in without knocking, her face pale with concern. "Sir, you need to see this right now," she said, holding up her phone to show him a live stream. "It's your wife." The moment Mr. Chen saw the screen, his whole body went rigid. There was his pregnant wife, standing in the heat, surrounded by neighbors with their phones out, while a police officer towered over her with an aggressive stance. The video already had thousands of viewers. He grabbed his keys, but his hands were trembling so badly he dropped them. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself. As the county's district attorney, he had handled countless cases of police misconduct, but never had it hit so close to home. Never had it involved his own wife and unborn child. "Cancel my meetings," he told his secretary, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "and get me Police Chief Williams on the phone immediately." The drive that usually took 20 minutes lasted only 12. Mr. Chen's mind raced with every passing second. His wife had told him about incidents like this happening to her before they were married, but he had never witnessed it firsthand. Now, watching it unfold through live streams as he drove, he felt a complex mix of emotions: rage, fear, determination, and a deep, aching sadness. His phone kept ringing. The police chief, the mayor, local news stations. He ignored them all, focusing only on reaching his wife. The live comments were flooding in by the hundreds. This is happening right now in Cedar Heights. Someone needs to help her. She's pregnant. This is absolutely horrible. Keep recording everything. As he turned onto their street, he could see the crowd before anything else. Neighbors standing with phones raised. Children on bikes watching from a safe distance. The flashing lights of the police car. And in the center of it all, his wife, still standing in the sweltering heat. Mr. Chen parked his car a short distance away. Years of legal experience had taught him the importance of approaching such situations carefully. He straightened his tie, took another deep breath, and stepped out into the heat. The crowd parted as he walked forward, some neighbors recognizing him immediately. He could hear their whispers. "That's the district attorney. It's her husband. Oh, now this officer is in real trouble." Officer Miller was still lecturing Mrs. Chen about the car when Mr. Chen approached. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't make any sudden moves. Instead, he walked with the measured pace of someone who had spent years in courtrooms, knowing that sometimes the quietest entrance makes the loudest statement. "Excuse me, officer," Mr. Chen said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his authority. "I believe you're currently detaining my wife." Officer Miller turned, irritation clear on his face at the interruption. "Sir, this is a police matter. Please step back and—" Mr. Chen reached slowly into his jacket, removing his credentials. "I'm District Attorney Chen. This is my wife you've had standing in the heat for the past 45 minutes, my pregnant wife." The change in Officer Miller's expression was instantaneous. The color drained from his face as recognition hit him. The district attorney wasn't just any public figure. He was known for his aggressive stance on police reform and his successful prosecution of officers who abused their power. The crowd had gone completely silent, phones still recording as Officer Miller's confident demeanor crumbled. He looked from the credentials to Mr. Chen's face, then to Mrs. Chen, then back to the credentials. His hand, which had been resting confidently on his belt, fell limply to his side. I was just conducting a routine traffic stop," Officer Miller stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We'll be reviewing all the footage of this routine traffic stop," Mr. Chen replied, his voice level but his eyes intense. "Every second of it. From every angle, including your body camera, which I trust has been running this entire time." The sirens of approaching police vehicles grew louder, but Mr. Chen wasn't finished. "But right now, my priority is getting my wife out of this heat and making sure our baby is okay. We'll discuss everything else, and we will discuss it after I've ensured their safety." The moment Mr. Chen arrived on scene, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. 2 police cruisers pulled up with their lights flashing, followed by an unmarked car carrying Police Chief Williams himself. The neighbors continued recording, their phones capturing every second of what was quickly becoming a pivotal moment for their community. "Get a chair for my wife immediately," Mr. Chen commanded, and 3 neighbors rushed to help. Mrs. Rodriguez returned first with a comfortable patio chair and a glass of cold water. The nurse who had been watching stepped forward, ready to check Mrs. Chen's vital signs. Officer Miller stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. His hand shook as he tried to return Mrs. Chen's license and registration, but Mr. Chen intercepted them. "Those will be entered into evidence," he said quietly, placing the documents in a manila envelope he brought from his car. "Along with your body camera footage, dash cam recordings, and every video being taken by these witnesses." The police chief approached, his face grim. "District Attorney Chen, I came as soon as I heard." He turned to Officer Miller, who seemed to shrink under his superior's stern gaze. "Officer, your body camera is on." Yes, sir," Officer Miller stammered. "It's been on the whole time." "Good," Mr. Chen said, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "Because I want everyone to see exactly what happened here. How a law enforcement officer chose to treat a pregnant woman on a day when the temperature is hitting 95 degrees. The nurse had finished checking Mrs. Chen's blood pressure. "It's elevated," she reported professionally. "She needs to get out of this heat and rest immediately. The baby's movement is also more active than ideal, suggesting distress." Mr. Chen's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Chief Williams, I trust you'll handle the immediate administrative aspects of this situation. My priority right now is my wife's health and our child's well-being." The police chief nodded gravely. "Officer Miller, surrender your badge and weapon. You're on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." The crowd watched as Officer Miller slowly unpinned his badge, his hands trembling. The same people who had witnessed his arrogance just minutes ago now saw a man facing the consequences of his actions in real time. "This isn't just about one incident," Mr. Chen addressed the gathering crowd, his arm supporting his wife as she sipped her water. "This is about a pattern that needs to stop. Every person who recorded today, every witness who spoke up, you're all part of the change we need." Andy, the teenager who had been live streaming, stepped forward. "Sir, the live stream has over 50,000 viewers now. People are sharing it everywhere." Mr. Chen nodded solemnly. "Good. Let them see. Let them all see what happened here today. But let them also see what happens next. How we as a community respond, how we demand better, how we make real change happen." Mrs. Chen squeezed her husband's hand. Despite her ordeal, her voice was steady as she addressed Officer Miller. "I hope you learn from this, not just because of who my husband is, but because every person deserves to be treated with basic human dignity." The police chief was already on his phone, calling in internal affairs. 2 more police cars arrived, these carrying officers from the Professional Standards Division. They began taking preliminary statements from witnesses, their faces serious as they watched the videos being shared. Mrs. Rodriguez brought out more chairs, and neighbors started sharing water bottles. What had begun as a scene of discrimination had transformed into a moment of community unity. Parents were explaining to their children the importance of standing up against injustice. Elderly residents were sharing stories of how far their neighborhood had come and how far it still needed to go. "The paramedics are on their way," the nurse announced, still monitoring Mrs. Chen closely. "Just as a precaution," she added, seeing the concern on Mr. Chen's face. Through it all, Officer Miller stood silent, watching as his career crumbled around him. His body camera was still recording, capturing every moment of his humiliation, not because of who Mrs. Chen's husband was, but because of who he had chosen to be that day. The sun was finally starting to lose some of its intensity as the paramedics arrived. As they helped Mrs. Chen into the ambulance for a checkup, neighbors came forward one by one, offering to email their videos, provide statements, or help in any way they could. "This doesn't end here," Mr. Chen promised the gathered crowd. "Today is just the beginning of some very necessary changes in our police department. Thank you all for being brave enough to stand up and do what's right." The next morning, the incident was everywhere. Local news stations played clips from the livestream on repeat. The teenager's video had reached over 1 million views overnight. People across the country were sharing it with hashtags calling for police reform and accountability. Inside the police department's internal affairs office, investigators watched the footage from multiple angles. Officer Miller's body camera told a damning story. Every dismissive comment, every aggressive gesture, every moment of discriminatory behavior was captured in crystal clear quality. "Play that section again," the lead investigator said, leaning forward in his chair. They watched as Officer Miller ignored Mrs. Chen's repeated requests to sit down as he made snide comments about her car as he questioned her presence in her own neighborhood. The investigator shook his head, making more notes in an already full notebook. Down the hall, Police Chief Williams faced a room full of reporters. "We are conducting a thorough investigation into yesterday's incident," he announced, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. "Let me be clear. Discrimination has no place in our police force." The reporters' questions came rapid fire. Was this an isolated incident? Are you reviewing Officer Miller's past conduct? How will this affect department policies? Have other complaints been filed against this officer? In his office, Mr. Chen reviewed Officer Miller's personnel file. Pages of civilian complaints emerged, most from minority residents, most dismissed without thorough investigation. He spread the documents across his desk, building a picture of a pattern that had been ignored for too long. His phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Mrs. Chen and the baby were doing fine, but the doctor recommended bed rest for the next few days. The stress of the incident had caused her blood pressure to spike dangerously high. At the local coffee shop, Mrs. Rodriguez sat with other neighbors who had witnessed the incident. Their phones kept buzzing with messages from friends who had seen the videos. "I've lived here 40 years, she told a reporter who had stopped by. "We've had problems before, but this time we have proof. This time, things have to change." The nurse who had helped Mrs. Chen had written a detailed medical report about the incident. "As a healthcare professional," she wrote, "I observed clear signs of physical and emotional distress caused by prolonged exposure to heat and unnecessary harassment." Her report would become key evidence in the investigation. Back at the police station, other officers watched the footage during their morning briefing. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own past behaviors. Others nodded grimly, knowing this was a wake-up call their department needed. By afternoon, the mayor called an emergency meeting with the police commission. "Our city is in the spotlight now," she said, looking at each committee member. "We can either use this moment to make real changes, or we can let it become another missed opportunity." In the Internal Affairs Office, more details emerged. A junior officer came forward, describing times when Officer Miller had made discriminatory comments during patrols. A dispatcher shared records of unusual patterns in his traffic stops. The wall of silence was cracking. Social media continued to buzz with activity. The teenager's livestream had been picked up by national news networks. Comments poured in from across the country. "This happened in my town too. Thank goodness people recorded it. This is why we need police reform. Those neighbors are heroes for speaking up." Mr. Chen received calls from civil rights organizations offering support. Police reform advocates reached out, asking him to speak at upcoming events. Local community leaders requested meetings to discuss changes in police training and accountability. At the end of the day, Chief Williams made another announcement. "Officer Miller has been suspended without pay pending the completion of our investigation. Additionally, we are launching a comprehensive review of all civilian complaints filed in the past 5 years." The City Council scheduled an emergency session to discuss police reform measures. The incident had become a catalyst for change that many had long fought for but few had thought possible. In their home, Mr. Chen sat beside his resting wife, holding her hand as they watched the news coverage. "I kept thinking about our baby," Mrs. Chen said softly. "About the world we're bringing them into. Maybe this will help make it a little better." Outside their window, a group of neighbors had gathered for a candlelight vigil. They held signs reading "Support our neighbors" and "Community stands together." What had started as one officer's discriminatory actions had sparked a movement for change that would reshape their entire community. 3 months after the incident, the police department's training room was packed with new recruits. At the front of the room stood Mr. and Mrs. Chen, their newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside them. The room was silent as dashcam footage from that hot afternoon played on the screen. "This is what abuse of power looks like," Mr. Chen said, his voice firm but calm. "And this is why we've completely revamped our department's training program." The recruits watched intently, many taking notes, others shaking their heads at Officer Miller's behavior. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her strength evident in every word. That day changed more than just one officer's career. It changed an entire system. She gently adjusted the blanket covering her sleeping daughter. "This little one will grow up in a community that stood up and said enough." The changes had been swift and significant. The police department had implemented mandatory monthly bias training. Every officer now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. A civilian oversight committee had been established, with Mrs. Rodriguez serving as one of its first members. Officer Miller's case had become a turning point. The investigation revealed a history of similar incidents, leading to his termination and a complete review of all his past arrests and citations. Other officers with concerning patterns were identified and either retrained or removed from the force. The teenager who live-streamed the incident had been invited to join the Youth Advisory Council for the police department. "We need young people's perspectives," the police chief had said during the council's first meeting. "We need their understanding of technology, their fresh eyes on old problems." The nurse who had helped Mrs. Chen that day now conducted health and safety briefings for officers, teaching them about medical emergencies and the importance of treating pregnant women and other vulnerable individuals with extra care. In the neighborhood, things had changed too. Weekly community meetings brought residents and police officers together for open discussions. Children who had witnessed the incident no longer felt fear when they saw a patrol car. Instead, they knew the officers by name, often waving as they passed by. The hardest part, Mrs. Chen told the recruits, wasn't the discrimination itself. It was knowing this happened to others who didn't have the same resources or support that I had. That's why these changes matter so much. Mr. Chen clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past 3 months. Complaints against officers down by 60%, community trust ratings up by 45%, and successful resolutions of civilian police conflicts increased by 70%. These numbers represent real people, he explained. Real changes in real lives. Every positive interaction builds trust. Every fair treatment strengthens our community. The police chief stood up to join them. 3 months ago, we were a department in crisis. Today, we're becoming a model for other cities. Next week, we have police chiefs from 3 other states coming to learn about our new training programs. In the back of the room, Andy, the teenage live streamer, was recording this session too. But this time with the department's full support. His social media followers had grown to include police reform advocates nationwide, and his thoughtful commentary on community police relations had earned him a scholarship to study criminal justice. Mrs. Rodriguez, watching from her seat on the Civilian Oversight Committee, smiled as she remembered the community's response that day. We didn't just witness history, she told a new committee member. We helped create it. The baby stood in her carrier, and Mrs. Chen picked her up, holding her close. This is why we do this work, she told the recruits, not just because of what happened to me, but because every person in every community deserves to feel safe, respected, and heard. As the session ended, the recruits lined up to thank the Chens and share their own stories. One young officer in training, with tears in her eyes, told Mrs. Chen, "My mother went through something similar 10 years ago. But nobody stood up for her. Nobody recorded it. Nobody made changes. Thank you for helping make sure that stops now." Outside the training room, the hallway walls displayed new additions. The department's updated mission statement, citizen rights bulletins in multiple languages, and a large photo of the community vigil that had followed the incident. Below it, a simple but powerful message read, "Change begins with us." The story of that hot afternoon had become more than just a viral video or a career-ending moment for one officer. It had become a catalyst for real change, a testament to the power of community action, and a reminder that justice works best when everyone stands together.